Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for coming tonight. My name is Olga Mistropova. I'm an assistant professor of Russian in the Department of World Languages and Cultures, and I'm also the director of Russian, Eurasian, and East European Studies program in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. And it is my pleasure to welcome you all to the REES, Russian, Eurasian, and East European Studies Distinguished Lecture Series. And on behalf of the REES program, I would like to thank you for joining us as we welcome our guest and distinguished speaker, Dr. Marshall Goldman. Dr. Goldman is a professor emeritus of Russian economics at Wellesley College and former associate director of the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University. As many of you probably know, Professor Goldman is one of the world's leading authorities on Russian history, politics, and economics. He has met with quite a few Russian presidents, including Mikhail Gorbachev and Vladimir Putin. He has advised former President George H.W. Bush and President George W. Bush on Russian affairs. And he continuously meets with business leaders and government officials at the highest levels in both countries. One of the Russian newspapers recently wrote, and I quote, "Marshall Goldman has a very unique position. Unlike politicians, he can speak freely without having to look over his shoulder. Unlike businessmen, he does not pursue personal interests. However, heads of the largest transnational companies, presidents of many nations, politicians, and diplomats have all relied on his expertise for years." Professor Goldman is the author of over a dozen books on Russia and former Soviet Union, among which are classics that probably a lot of us use in our classes, such as USSR in Crisis, The Failure of an Economic System, Gorbachev Challenge, Economic Reform in the Age of High Technology, and What Went Wrong with Perestroika, The Rise and Fall of Michael Gorbachev. Professor Goldman frequently writes for such publications as Foreign Affairs, the Harvard Business Review, the New Yorker, and the Atlantic Monthly. His expertise is also very extensively sought by the media, and you may have seen him on CNN, Good Morning America, Crossfire, Face of the Nation, Today Show, and Nightline. Professor Goldman's most recent book, Petrostate, Putin Power and the New Russia, has just come out with Oxford University Press in April 2008. And I should add that several of Professor Goldman's books, including the most recent one, will be available for sale after the talk, and he'll be available to autograph the books for you. Finally, I would like to acknowledge the sponsors of today's event. They are the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, the Russian, Eurasian, and East European Studies program, the Committee on Lectures, the World Affairs Series, the Miller Lecturer Fund, and the Department of Economics. Professor Goldman will be using some handouts in his talk, and I believe some of you have those handouts. I don't think we made enough copies. Pat Miller in the lectures program is promising me that all of those PowerPoints will be scanned and put up on the lectures program's website. So they'll be available soon. All this said, please join me in giving a warm welcome to our guest and distinguished speaker today, Professor Marshall Goldman, whose talk is entitled Putin's Petrostate, Power, Patronage, and the New Russia.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the fact that it's the night before the election, and there are lots of things to do beforehand. So I will try to be brief, and I'll try to explain what I'm trying to get at early on. I should tell you that, as you heard, I've been lecturing for a long time, and I know at the beginning of the lecture everybody's awake. Nobody's yet asleep here. Middle of the lecture tonight, particularly, half of you are either going to be asleep or beginning to worry, why am I not out campaigning? By the end of the lecture, I think most of you, when is he going to finish so we can get out of here? So I'll tell you what my theme is in the beginning, and so if you have to leave in the middle and people say, what did he talk about, you'll know and you won't have missed anything. The theme is basically that would Russia be different without Putin? And what I'm going to try to do is explain that notion. And I'm going to do something unusual. It drives me crazy when I go to a lecture and somebody does it, so you'll have to forgive me for doing it, but I'm going to do it anyway, and that is read from my own book. I mean, sometimes when that happens to me, I say, hasn't he read the book already? Does he have to read it? in front of us. But let me explain why I'm doing it. For the first time in my life, I got an agent. I never have used an agent before to help me find a publisher. And the agent said, I showed her the manuscript, and she says, "You must be kidding. People aren't going to read this. You've got to make them want to read it." I said, "Well, if I make them want to read it, I'll lose my license as an economist." She said, "Well, you can't, if it's going to be a general book, you can't assign it to them. They're going to have to want to read it, so you've got to make it interesting." So I said, "Well, what? I don't know anything that's interesting." But I'm going off to Russia. I have become part of a group called the Valdai Hills Group, which is sponsored by the Novosti Press Agency as an attempt to kind of influence opinion makers, critics. And they take us around, and they were going to take us out to the Pryobskaya oil field in Siberia. So I said, well, maybe I'll go out there and maybe I'll see something and I can add to the beginning. But we went out there, and it was very interesting, I have to say, but I couldn't think of how I could fit it into the manuscript. Right after that, however, they took us to Gazprom headquarters, and I'm going to talk a lot about Gazprom, but let me just say for now, Gazprom is Russia's largest company, and it's the largest producer of natural gas in the world, larger than anything that comes out of Saudi Arabia. I said, maybe I'll find something there. And so maybe to fantasize about it. And anyway, so I did. And, economists don't usually fantasize, or maybe some people think that's all they do is fantasize. But anyway, we walked in, and I'll just read you. This, the first page of the book, is just kind of description of what took place. And the section is headed, "The author is James Bond." I mean, talk about fantasy. But there it is. Okay, so at first I was puzzled. Where were they taking us? For such a big, sleek glass Moscow high-rise, Gazprom's elevator in its headquarters building was tiny. 5 people could barely squeeze in, and its hall corridors narrow. If any of you have ever been to Moscow, it's in the southwest part of the city, and it's a big building. There are no other high-rise buildings around it. And to come in and get into this little elevator certainly seems strange. This was, after all, the world's largest producer of natural gas, not to mention Russia's largest company. Following a short walk, we were ushered into a dark and silent room where nothing seemed to be happening. Strange. It was only when all the members of our group had made their way up on the elevators that the room suddenly came alive. Then for a time I felt as if I'd wandered into a NASA space center, or was it a James Bond movie set? All that was missing was that out-of-body voice intoning, "Welcome, Mr. Goldman. We were expecting you," if you've ever seen James Bond. Okay, anyway, in front of me, basically a wall this size, covering the whole 100-foot wall of the room, was a map with a spider web-like maze of natural gas pipelines reaching from East Siberia west to the Atlantic Ocean, or this way, and from the Arctic Ocean south to the Caspian and Black Sea. And manipulating this display were Gazprom dispatchers, 3 men controlling the flow of Gazprom's gas to East and West European consumers of this Russian gas monopoly. No wonder there was such tight security. There was also a sense of self-assurance. As measured by the value of its corporate stock by the summer of 2006, when we visited, Gazprom, the state-dominated joint stock company, until 1992 was actually the Soviet Ministry of the Gas Industry, had become the world's 3rd largest corporation in terms of its capitalized value. Only private shareholder-owned ExxonMobil and General Electric were larger. I'll read one more sentence and that's it. With a flick of a switch, those dispatchers sitting in this Moscow room could freeze and indeed have frozen entire countries. At the very least, they could send their citizens off in a panic in search of sweaters, scarves, and blankets. So it's just this kind of thing, and I must say, it's the first time in my life I ever wrote a book with a picture in it. But I managed to find a picture of that room, of that dispatching room, and it's like NASA. It's like, if you've seen the map, and lights are blinking and gas is moving, and you can see the dispatchers sitting here with their screens with this enormous amount of power. So you've got this sense of stranglehold on Western Europe. And what was also important is that this was, I say, 2006, but it's continued since then. Russia, and this is what the handouts are. If you don't have one, you may want to sit with somebody, or if you can see the screen this way. There'll be some more fine detail later, which which you may want to look at more carefully. But anyway, if you look at what's going on here, these are the Yeltsin years. And 1992 to 1996, there's a slight uptick. The dark line is the GDP. But in these early years, the Russia GDP is falling on something like 14 to 15% a year. That's devastating. If you accumulate this, and particularly with 1998, that means that Russia had a drop of about 40% in its GDP. That's greater than what we suffered in the Great Depression of the 1930s. Some are saying we may be back there again today, but anyway, for Russia, this was just crippling for it. And what you have to then come to appreciate is that it was bankrupt. In 1998, its stock market fell. The Russian treasury was empty. There was no money. They were down to just a few $100 million from a position where they had considerably more, and that those $100 millions were turning into $10 millions of dollars, which was not enough to pay their bills. They defaulted on their debt. We had echoes of that in this country. Our stock market in 1998 went down in response to that by about 20%. There was a hedge fund called Long-Term Capital Management, which was headquartered in Greenwich, Connecticut. It had lent money to others that were lending money to the Russians. The Russians defaulted, saying, we're not going to pay you back. And Long-Term Capital Management was in danger of collapsing, and the Federal Reserve Bank stepped in at that point to rescue it with a loan. Again, it's like deja vu that we're seeing these days. Because they were worried that if long-term capital management disappeared and collapsed, it would bring down the whole American financial system. So this I say, had ramifications, reverberations outside of Russia. So this is what was going on there. Now look what's happened after this, beginning in 1999. Again, the dark line showing a GDP, a growth of 7 to 8%, a little bit more in some cases. Cumulative from then to 2007, and what you have then is a doubling of the GDP. And what is significant in this case is that Putin is appointed as the prime minister in August 1999, and look what happens. It goes up, and he's appointed acting president on December 31st, 1999, then he wins the election on his own in March 2000, and then it goes up this way. So you can see why the Russian public thinks that Putin is their great savior. He comes along and things turn around. Just as a word of what I may say at the very end is that this is where he leaves now. Of course, he leaves his job as president, and what happens, he leaves the price of production may begin to fall. Also, this is all going on, and I've got it related here with the white line, and that's oil production. And of course, what's happening is oil production is falling here. And so what you have to ask then is, again, that question that I began with in the beginning, to what extent is all this due to Putin, or is it indeed due to the oil production? And what does Putin do to the oil production, if anything, which leads to this really fascinating kind of result? And he leaves, oil prices fall, as they're doing, as they have just done. Anyway, what has happened here, at least until about a month or two ago, Russia had accumulated holdings of reserves, dollars, euros, other foreign currencies, over $500 billion, close to $600 billion. So from zero in 1998, or near zero in 1998, virtual bankruptcy, to this kind of thing, Russia has turned around and become incredibly powerful, incredibly wealthy. And you can understand again why Putin is such a powerful and politically attractive person to most Russians. So would Russia be any different without him? And the answer is it would be different without him. It wouldn't have done these kinds of things. But it would have had this growth in any case because of what's taking place here, this drop in oil production and the growth that occurred subsequently or coincided with Putin's coming to power. And the answer, of course, why that happens, it's not Putin doesn't change oil production. What happens is that oil prices here are $10 to $12 a barrel, and they gradually begin to rise until recently. In any case, they were $145 a barrel. I tell my wife, and you'll hear a lot about her tonight, because she's my biggest critic, I tell my wife that if I had been president of Russia and this had happened while I was the president, even I would look like a genius. It didn't take that much, unless you can prove to me that Putin is the reason why oil prices rose, and that's not the case. And anyway, that's why I call the book Petrostate. She was opposed to that too. She'll think people were thinking you're talking about prostate. It's not prostate. It's Petrostate, because indeed that's what's happening here. And it's, does the GDP cause the oil production to drop, or does the GDP rise cause oil production to go up? It's not that relationship. The relationship is that it's oil that makes the difference. It's really a monostate, a monoculture, where oil is the determinant of all these kinds of things. And unless you can then show me that he brings about Putin as responsible for the changes in oil production, the price in oil production, it's just coincidence. So what difference does Putin make? Well, Putin does make a difference. And one of the things that Putin does is he begins to focus on what can be done to make bring back Russia's superpower status. Most of you know that Putin was a member of the KGB, the secret police. He grew up in what was then Leningrad, became St. Petersburg, and he went to law school. Law school in the Soviet Union was an undergraduate career. You didn't go to law school after you graduated undergraduate work. You went to law school as an undergraduate, and he wanted to join the KGB. In 1968, in fact, while he was still in high school, he went to the KGB offices in Leningrad, knocked on the door, and said, "I'd like to join." Now, what is unusual about that, or what is significant about that, is 1968, you may remember, was the year they invaded Czechoslovakia. The Soviets invaded Czechoslovakia, put down the Prague Spring. So to want to join the KGB at that time suggests somebody whose instincts were not exactly those of a Democrat. In fact, Putin has said that the greatest tragedy of the 20th century was the collapse of the Soviet Union, which I think very few of us would feel that's the greatest tragedy of the 20th century. Anyway, that shows you where he comes from and what he's thinking and how he feels. So this is not a great liberal by any manner or means. Anyway, he goes ultimately, finishes law school. The KGB does call him and invites him to join as a KGB member, and ultimately he's assigned to East Germany as an agent, and he's working in East Germany. And then, of course, the Berlin Wall collapses, falls, Germany, the Berlin Wall comes down in 1989. The West Germans unite with the East Germans and basically take over the country. And at that point, there's no role then for the KGB as Putin was doing it in East Germany. And so he's unemployed. So he goes back home to Leningrad, and he looks for a job. And his former law professor, a man by the name of Sobchak, hires him and says, "Oh, you be the deputy governor, the deputy mayor of Leningrad," which in the process became St. Petersburg. That was traditionally a position held by a KGB agent whose responsibility was keeping an eye on foreigners. He'd come in as a deputy governor and be responsible for foreign economic activities. Then, unfortunately for Putin, his friend Sobchak loses the election, and so once again he's unemployed. In this process, he begins to think about what Russia should do to regain that superpower status. He's living through this. He's seeing the country fall apart. The country is being broken up into 15 different republics, 15 different countries. It's really a sad time. Russia loses its superpower status at that point. And so Putin asks himself, what can we do? What should Russia do? How can we get the country back together again as a superpower? Now, understand, he's just doing this as an academic exercise, and for the most part, academic exercises mean just think about it, it's never going to bear fruit. It's how we kind of put down something, but he does it. And he thinks about what can be done, and he concludes that the only thing that Russia can do at this time is to take advantage of the resources it's had. It's its comparative advantage, as an economist would say. That's the one thing that it has. And so he begins to think about what Russia could do, and he writes a dissertation of sorts. It's not a PhD degree, but it's more than a master's degree. We've managed to get a copy of it. This is for real now. And two people in Washington, one of whom works for the Brookings Institution, managed to get a hold of the manuscript and look through it. And what the manuscript does, Putin calls for national champions. By national champions, he means something like maybe ExxonMobil, which will use Russia's resources. In the Soviet period, it was the world's largest producer of petroleum, larger than the United States or larger than Saudi Arabia. Take those resources and use them on behalf of the state. And what is particularly interesting about this is that these people at Brookings went through the Russian manuscript, and so interesting, where did Putin come up with this idea of national champions? And they discovered that there was one footnote in the whole thing that they looked at, which was a book that referred to something that two professors at Pittsburgh University wrote, calling for national champions. It turns out Putin plagiarized it 10 to 15 pages, word for word. Next time you see Putin, you can ask him about it. I've chosen not to ask him, did you really plagiarize? But anyway, it turns out that he did. And if you become the president of Russia, you can do exactly the same thing. But he takes this idea, and if you look at the next table, you can see that when Putin becomes the president, he immediately begins to implement his blueprint. He's elected president on his own, I say, in March 2000. And he goes after the raw material companies that he has, and of course natural gas. Gazprom, the company that I began with the lecture reading from the book, which had been the ministry of the Soviet gas ministry. And he begins to reshape that company. It had been created as Gazprom, and he began to remove the officers. First person he went out after in June, right after he's elected in March, and June he's beginning to do this. He goes out after Viktor Chernomyrdin. Viktor Chernomyrdin had been in the Soviet era the minister of the gas industry. So in a sense, Chernomyrdin is back where he's at, but in the interim he becomes prime minister, and then he begins to strip assets. What do I mean by stripping assets? He began to move to take some of the gas-producing fields and push them off into another company that he and Rem Vyakarev, who was the CEO, who's removed in May the following year. So within a year's time, basically, Gazprom has been reshaped with two proteges of Putin, and then becomes now this national champion. And he begins to punish Vyakarev, who had been Chernomyrdin's deputy, even in the days of the Soviet Ministry of the Gas Industry, pushed them out because, as it turns out, both of them were stripping assets and sending off to a variety of companies, one of which was called Itera. And as far as we can tell, it was very opaque, but Itera is controlled by the wives of the executives of Gazprom, including Chernomyrdin and Vyakarev, their sons and their mistresses. It's a big, happy family this way. And they're beginning to set up these companies. Itera becomes, as I say, the second largest producer of natural gas in Russia. Which makes Itera particularly of interest to us in the United States is that the headquarters of Itera is in Jacksonville, Florida. Why Jacksonville, Florida? Why not? It's warmer. It's far from Moscow. It's, the beaches are nearby, which you can't say about it. And Itera then becomes this operator of this gas field. The gas fields in Russia, becomes a very wealthy company. Now, what does any good red-blooded energy company do in the United States once it's here, it's operating? What's the first thing you do? You get a lobbyist. And so where do they find a lobbyist? Well, they find a young woman who just by coincidence happens to be the daughter of an American congressman. I mean, if you're going to have a lobbyist, what kind of lobbyist do you have if you don't have somebody in Washington who's doing this? And his name was Curt Weldon. He was a 10-term congressman from outside, not Jacksonville, where it's headquartered, but Philadelphia. Why Philadelphia? Well, he had a daughter, and he certainly wasn't representing Jacksonville in this kind of thing. Anyway, so and what happens? ITRA pays Weldon's daughter $300,000 as a retainer, which catches Weldon's interest. He in turn reciprocates. He arranges for ITRA to have a presentation at the Library of Congress in Washington. He goes down to Jacksonville to help them dedicate their new offices. And he arranges for an $800,000 grant from the U.S. Trade and Development Commission to help explore for natural gas in Russia, which is not normally the purview of a group like this. I mean, it's earmarking of the sort. It's not a bridge to nowhere, but it comes to much the same kind of thing. This all came out in the last election, 2006, and after having served 10 terms, Weldon lost the election. But it's on the record, and it's a rather, they're doing what all energy companies do, so maybe it's not that atypical. I should add, by the way, that there was another congressman who was also involved with Russian energy companies, and that's Tom DeLay, the Hammer, as he was called. Tom DeLay was from Texas, and he served as a lobbyist for another Russian company called NAFTA-SIB. NAFTA is the word for oil in this case, and SIB was for Siberia. He represented them and helped to do a variety of things on their behalf. So basically, with all this money that the Russian energy companies were creating, they were beginning to buy their way even in the United States. The same kind of pattern, of course, held in Europe. So you had this kind of thing taking place, and the national champions then became very important. Look at the rest here. Gusinski, of course, is Media Moss. That's a media company. That doesn't count so much, but it goes after Berezovsky. Berezovsky, who fled to England, controlled Sibneft. Sibneft was taken over and becomes part of Rosneft. Rosneft becomes Russia's largest energy company, taking in particular assets from Khodorkovsky. Some of you may have heard of his name. He's finishing an 8-year term of jail in Siberia. He headed Yukos. Yukos's resources were taken. Yukos was Russia's richest oil company. Khodorkovsky was Russia's richest man until at least he was sent off to jail. And Yukos becomes part of Rosneft. They're all kind of merged into these national companies, which is doing what Putin said should be done this way. And you can see the impact of these national champions. By the year 2000, when Putin comes in, the share of state entities, state corporations in the production of oil had fallen to 10%. This year it's back up to 50%. So in effect, he's been renationalizing these companies in a very effective way. And Gazprom, again, being this, it's a hybrid because there's also, you could own stock in it. In the year 2000, its capitalized value, meaning you take its stock and you add up the total, how much is it worth, is $9 billion. By June of this year, 2008, it's risen to $350 billion. So if you had invested in Gazprom with a share of stock, you would have, they didn't increase the number of shares, the value of the shares increased. So Gazprom became a very major source of economic growth, stock market growth in Russia, from $9 billion to $350 billion. I suspect none of the students have done this, but some of the senior people here, if they've invested in TIAA-CREF or other mutual funds, many American mutual funds were investing in Russian companies, including Gazprom, because it was one of the fastest growing stocks that were available in the outside world, from $9 billion to $350 billion is a pretty it's more than compound interest. Let me suggest that. What is also significant, of course, is that in the last few weeks, it's taken a pounding. At one point, when I began the book, when I wrote the book, Gazprom, as I said, was the world's third largest corporation. For a time, it actually was the second largest. Number one was ExxonMobil. Number two was General Electric. General Electric has had some problems, and Gazprom moved from number 3 to number 2. Now with the collapse of the stock market, and in Russia the stock market has fallen further than any other stock market in a major country. It's down 75%. Ours is down less, bad enough as it is here, it's less than 50%. The price of, as you know, the price of oil has fallen from $145 a barrel now below $70 a barrel. It's half of what it was. My wife says, indeed, the book is obsolete. It's dead. It's dead because the petrostate now is kind of a puny state now, but it's still there, and it's significant. Anyway, the value of Gazprom, which I began saying it was up to $350 billion after starting at 9, and now it's down to $70 billion. It was the third largest, then the second largest corporation in the world. Now it's the 33rd because the stock in Russia has fallen so much farther than any place else. But the significance is still there. Oil has brought in for them, the Russians, money. Oil generates the money. Russia has reserves, even now, third largest in the world. Largest is China. Second largest is Japan, and the third largest is Russia. They still have holdings that are, again, they're no longer 600 billion, but they're down to maybe 500. They're kind of burning it to prop up some of the companies that exist there. But it's the gas which is still very significant. Why is the gas significant? Well, maybe I should just do one other thing and show you the how Putin has taken over. Then I'll explain why the gas is so significant. What Putin has done very effectively is he has brought in his buddies as patronage to kind of back him up. And so what I have here is the Silovikian business. Silo, as those of you who are taking Russian know, means strength. So in a sense, we would translate, or you can translate it loosely, as law and order types. What happens when you retire from the FBI? Well, in some cases you go to work for, as an executive in a corporation, or even a better example would be as generals retire from the Pentagon, they go to work for military-industrial complex companies. Well, that's what's equivalent here. So look, you can see how Putin has brought in his friends, his associates, and put them in positions of power, partly by kicking out the first echelon of what we call oligarchs, the people who took over the privatization of these ministries. As they are pushed out, Putin puts in his own people. Remember, I said Putin comes from St. Petersburg? So look, you can see with the star here, those who come from St. Petersburg, also former veterans of the KGB. So one of the best examples is Sechin. You can see the two symbols there for Sechin, from St. Petersburg and a KGB agent. What was Sechin doing? Well, he was double dipping. His daytime job was as deputy chairman of the Kremlin administration. Now there've been some reshuffling, and actually now he is one of the deputy prime ministers, an even higher position. But what was he doing on the side? Well, on the side, Sechin was the chairman of Rosneft, the company I've been talking about. Russia's largest energy company now, one of its richest companies. And so inevitably, of course, in this process, Sechin is going to make money. Let me just point out to you that, Forbes magazine publishes a list of the world's billionaires. Russia now has the second largest number of people on that list, second only to the United States. Germany was number 2, they eclipsed Germany. Moscow has more billionaires than New York City, than Manhattan. Again, partly these guys, as well as some of the hangovers from the oligarch thing. So look at, even here, another example, Medvedev. Medvedev was chairman of Gazprom. He was the chairman of the Kremlin administration. And now, of course, what is he? He's the president of Russia. He was Putin's protege who just brought him along this way. So he now controls Gazprom, the company that I've been talking about. So you go through this and you see these people doing much the same kind of thing. There's too much detail. You really should have a table, but that's what she said would be put on the internet. And then one other thing that's kind of unique to Russia that did not happen in the Soviet Union, they have what are called princelings. This is a Chinese concept. Princelings means the children of the politically powerful, the members of the Politburo. In China, the children, for the most part, are of these political figures, the head of the Politburo and things of this sort, go and get cushy jobs working for either foreign companies or Chinese businesses, corporations. So look what happens here. In Russia, the governor of St. Petersburg, Matvinenko, her son is working for Neshtorg Bank, a Russian bank. Look at a better illustration is Patrushev. Patrushev was the head of the KGB. Two sons. One goes to work for Neshtorg Bank. The other becomes the advisor to the CEO of Rosneft. Again, the company that I've been talking about. So this is how they enrich themselves and get this kind of patronage. It's not to say that this is a concept that's unique to Russia. I mean, you know, we have similar things in the United States and in other countries as well. But it did not happen in the Soviet period, and it really is quite impressive by what's happening. But the thing that for me is the most interesting is the last table that I want to talk about. And it was this, more than anything, that made me decide to write the book. I'd been working on energy matters in the Soviet Union and in Russia for some time, and I'd been giving lectures, and I heard references or seen references to the fact that Russia was becoming an important source of supply to Europe. And I said I'd really better pin it down instead of just saying it's an important source of supply. Let me go out and get some concrete data. So I went to the library, and there's something called the International Energy Agency, and they publish some statistical material, and I got some of their materials, and I looked country by country. I went back to my office, and I put this table together, and I said, oh my God, I don't know how many people are aware of this. My book has just been criticized by the deputy chairman of Gazprom for pointing things like this out, saying that Gazprom really has a stranglehold on Europe. Look what's happening. Take Germany. Germany gets 42% of its natural gas from Russia. What is significant about that is I say oil brings in the money, but it's the natural gas that's strategically important. Why is natural gas strategically important? Because it's delivered by pipeline. It's like an umbilical cord. Oil, I say, brings in the money, but if there should be an embargo, as we had in 1973 on oil coming from the Middle East, it'll hurt. Prices will go up. There will be lines at the gas pump for a while, but ultimately it'll shake down, and because we'll find other sources of petroleum. Canada, even Venezuela at one point, other countries in Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, the North Sea, other things we can kind of substitute. But with natural gas, if natural gas is cut off, there's no substitute if you're part of that pipeline. And if you're at the end of the pipeline, as Germany is, at least in the eastern end of the pipeline, and your main source of supply comes from Germany and it's cut off, comes from Russia and you're cut off, that goes back to that first page of the book that I read, you freeze. Because there's no substitutes. And somewhere down the line, it may be that we'll have developed liquefied natural gas enough that it can be brought in and you can deal on the spot market. But now with LNG, it's so expensive, it costs, part of it usually a couple of $1 billion, which means you can only have long-term contracts. You can't just deal on the spur of the moment. But oil, I say, can come in by tanker, it can come in by pipeline, it can come in by truck, come in by railroad car, but gas comes just in this form of that pipeline. And you cut off that pipeline, you really do freeze this way. So Italy, almost everybody in Europe is very heavily dependent on it. Look at Italy, gets 30%. Now Italy is at the other end of the pipeline, is at the western end of the pipeline, and so they are not as dependent as Germany. They can get some of their natural gas from Algeria or from the North Sea, but the Algerian fields and the North Sea fields are being depleted, whereas the Russian fields are still quite extensive, and we think there's even more there. If you come down to the eastern part of Europe, Central Europe or eastern part of Europe, you're 100%. And you can see then how strategic it is. And so when Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, decides that she does not want to fight to have Ukraine and Georgia become part of NATO, is she doing it because, indeed, it doesn't make sense to have them part of NATO, or because she's intimidated? And you can't tell. I mean, there's good reason for saying Georgia, which is not contiguous to other members of NATO, should not be part of NATO. But Ukraine is, and it may be that it should become a part of NATO, which the Russians don't want it to happen. And so Angela Merkel, as far as we can tell, has decided, I don't want to fight, I don't want to get involved in that battle. Why rile the Russians unnecessarily so when we get stuck this way? Because indeed, they've had experience in January 2006 and in 2007 when gas was cut off for other reasons, because the Russians wanted Ukraine to pay a higher price. The Ukrainians didn't want to do it, so the Russians reduced the flow of gas to Ukraine, which in turn reduced the flow of gas to Germany, because the pipeline to Germany goes through Ukraine. And so, you know, what is cause and what is effect? All we know is it's a powerful tool. It's a tool the Russians didn't have, and I argue in the book that it's a more powerful tool than the Russians have ever had regard to Western Europe. That includes Tsarist Russia, that includes the Soviet Union. How can you say it's more powerful than what happened in the Soviet Union days when the Soviets had nuclear weapons? Well, because I would argue that the nuclear weapons that the Soviets had were, in a sense, useless because they knew we had nuclear weapons. And there was something called MAD, mutually assured destruction. And the Soviets knew that if they used their nuclear weapons, we'd use ours. And we knew if we used our nuclear weapons, they'd use theirs. And so it was a standoff. But with this, there's nothing like that. There's no standoff. There's nothing that we can use to intimidate the Russians and prevent them from turning off the natural gas, because they'll just do it, and there's really no penalty this way. So it is, again, I say, just an incredibly powerful tool. Not so much because of the money that it brings, although it does bring in some, but again, as I say, because of the strategic importance that's there. Well, recently Putin, as the price of energy has collapsed, doesn't have as much power as he had before, but he still is very strong, very powerful, partly because he really sees that he's restored Russia to something like a superpower status, partly because the prosperities of peace, doubled the economy. Russians are much better off than they were before. And in part that accounts for what he did in Georgia, the Republic of Georgia, putting it down. He feels that there's no penalty that can be inflicted on Russia for doing this. And so he has, in a sense, a new sense of pride, a new sense of Russia is there. And of course, Putin himself is younger. He's in kind of the image in our country. The best analogy would be Jack Kennedy, kind of a young guy. You see Putin with his shirt off, his muscles bulging. He's a judo fanatic and all this. But also mentally, he is very outspoken and very strong. I've had the chance to meet with him now 5 times, and he likes to engage in intellectual debate as well as physical prowess. And this intellectual debate and this sense of accomplishment is reflected in a variety of things that he's done. And I'll just read one example that I do have in the book. But this is at a press conference that Putin had in June last year. It's in press conferences in Germany, and the question I'm going to quote from is given to him by one of the correspondents from Der Spiegel, a German periodical. And I'll just read you the translated transcript. Mr. President, former Federal Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder, the predecessor to Angela Merkel, called you a pure Democrat. Do you consider yourself as such? Now, let me just interject here that this is also so fascinating here. Schroeder is a prostitute. He was the chancellor, but on his watch, he basically increased Russia's dependence on this natural gas. That's the reason it's so high. He began to phase out nuclear energy facilities, and he did everything he could to increase Germany's dependence on Russia. The reason I call him a prostitute is that when he left office, he was hired by Putin to chair the building of a pipeline between Russia and Germany, so that would bypass both Ukraine and Poland, so neither one of those countries could turn off the valve. This was to be a pipeline that's built under the Baltic Sea to finesse that kind of thing. And of course, he gets a very high salary for this kind of thing. All he does is just preside over it. He doesn't do anything more. This is basically, the Germans think of him as just being bought for that particular purpose. Okay, anyway, that's not the point of the quotation here, but I can't miss saying some nice things about him. Anyway, so Putin's response to that question, do you consider yourself a pure Democrat? And in parentheses, the transcript, he laughs. Am I a pure Democrat? Of course I am, absolutely. But you know what the problem is? It's not even a problem, but it's a real tragedy. The problem is that I'm all alone, the only one of my kind in the whole wide world. Just look at what's happening in North America, and what he says here is absolutely appropriate. It's simply awful. Torture, homeless people, Guantanamo, people detained without trial and an investigation. Just look at what's happening in Europe. Harsh treatment of demonstrators, rubber bullets and tear gas used first in one capital, then in another. Demonstrators killed in the street. All fair, but for God's sakes, man, look over your shoulder, because everything he's saying here you could say about Russia, but as an offensive player, he puts the burden on it. Okay, then, so what's the point of this? He ends this intervention by saying there's no one to talk to since Mahatma Gandhi died. Well, I mean, this, as a pure Democrat, that's all he has, and that's his. I hope most of you know who Mahatma Gandhi is, but anyway, that's he's no longer around. But that's the way it is, and that's Putin, and that reflects this sense of power and the new Russia. So if any of you have questions, I'd be happy to respond to the questions. Anybody have yes, sir? I think there's a microphone there if you don't mind using it. I don't know if the microphone is on. I mean, that's another question, but I don't hear it. Well, I don't know, maybe there's a button there. I don't know. Well, I'll repeat the question if I can hear it. Yeah, the question is how much of the price of oil is going to speculators, how much of it is going to producers? And this is a question that's being debated quite extensively. One of the things we discovered is, because the price of oil jumped so high, worldwide price of oil, not just Russian oil, worldwide price of oil jumped so high within less than a year, to $145 a barrel. Of course, now we know the answer is that it's fallen by half, and so some of it clearly was speculation. But one of the problems, and one of the things we have to worry about, is that in the case of Russia, at least, and let me answer for Russia, the price of developing oil is very high. And going back to that first table, what, as I said, what's significant here, of course, is what's happening as oil prices are down. And production begins to increase the minute that oil prices go up, because the geological conditions in Russia are very extreme, very in the north. And unless the price of oil is as high as $60, $70 a barrel, it doesn't pay to develop those fields, because you've got to build an infrastructure, you've got to build a pipeline system, and just working in the Arctic is more challenging than it would be working in Saudi Arabia. In Saudi Arabia, of course, they can make a profit on, they can pay for the oil at a very low price, $20, $30 a barrel, even less. So what happens is that oil prices go up, then production will go up to take advantage of that. And the problem is now, as oil prices have fallen, some of the drilling, some of the new building of infrastructures stopped. And that's part of our problem in the world. As oil prices rise, we start to conserve. Automobile usage in the United States has fallen about 10%, just simply because it's too expensive to go elsewhere. Of course, the economy shrinks too. We're getting a recession in part this way. So, we get rid of big cars and SUVs and start going to smaller cars. Then the price drops, and it's back, happy days are here again, and we forget about conservation, and we forget about drilling because we can't afford these things. So it's a secular kind of business, and it knocks the props out from long-term capital projects that might find alternative sources and energy, windmills, solar. Why should I build a solar facility on my home if it's going to cost me, if I know that the oil price is going to go down and I can do things, get electricity and heat much cheaper than having to build this thing and put out the capital for it. So it's part of the problem. But for the Russians, it's only profitable for them when oil prices start to rise, as they did here. So I can't, it varies. What is the price? How much is speculative? We know that some of it was speculative indeed, but a lot of it, as we bring in the new fields here, was also going to the cost of production. Yeah.
Has Russia been able to redirect any of this money toward other sectors of the economy? Or are they still have they switched from overinvesting in durable goods manufacturing to overinvesting in energy?
Have the Russians been able to switch to take some of the profits from this and switch to other sectors? Putin recognizes this need. The trouble is, Russia has never been much of an innovator this way, either in the Tsarist era. I mean, it's a mono economy. In the Soviet period, they did export military munitions, but that was heavily subsidized. If it's on a commercial basis, it's rare. Putin has done his best to try to divert some of the resources to nanotechnology. He wants Russia to be a leader in nanotechnology, but even this is a problem. And again, because, there's another problem here, and that is oil revenues increase from Russia. That pushes up the value of the ruble. In other words, dollars, euros come into Russia. We, for example, are spending $10 billion importing Russian petroleum. And as we do that, that pushes up the value of the ruble, which until, again, the last few days was increasing in value. The dollar was falling in value. Now it's been reversed because of the financial turmoil. But as the ruble becomes more expensive, it makes it more difficult to try to generate industrial production that's other than oil, other than commodities. The reason for that is that as the ruble becomes more expensive, for those of you who've had any exposure to economics, that means exports from Russia become more expensive because you've got to pay it costs you more dollars to get those rubles to buy those goods. By the same token, it means that for a Russian with rubles that are buy more dollars, you can import more because the dollar is so much stronger. So that makes it difficult to build up any domestic industry that way. Right now, until recently anyway, as the dollar was falling in value, that was helping our export sector. Just the reciprocal of what was going on in Russia. So even if you try and you want to build up your manufacturing sector, it becomes difficult when the ruble is strong and you've got an export sector like this. So, and of course, that's not the only factor, as I said. They just don't have that kind of experience. So they really don't have much. Agriculture is getting better. They are now beginning to export grain again. And the reason for that is, this was what was America's largest export to Russia. It was wheat and corn. And now what is happening, of course, is that the Russians are exporting grain again because they don't have to feed it to their livestock. What they're doing is they're importing livestock. So our biggest export now periodically is chickens. They're called bushwings because part of our foreign aid program was George Bush Sr. The Russians we like the wings, they like the legs. They were bush legs rather, not bush wings. They like that part of the chicken, and it has just continued that way. So they don't have to use their grain to breed livestock. But that's, again, what it's not manufacturing sector. Yep.
You mentioned how dependent a lot of European nations are on the Russian natural gas. I read recently an article in a newspaper about how Russia is in plans with a couple other countries.
How Russia what?
How Russia wants to make an OPEC-type
Yeah.
cartel with natural gas.
Yeah.
What kind of ramifications?
Oh, the question is, recently there has been discussion about trying to create an OPEC-like organization for gas producers. I call it an OGEC, Organization of Gas Exporting Countries. And they've just, the head of Gazprom just visited Libya to talk about it. There's some talk about Qatar in the Persian Gulf and Iran, which are all big gas producers. I argue in the book, and I may be proven wrong, I argue in the book that that's not likely. First of all, Russia is not a member of OPEC, even though it's been it alternates with being the world's largest producer of petroleum next to Saudi Arabia. Why aren't they a member? Because they get all the benefits of belonging to OPEC without belonging. What do I mean by that? Well, let OPEC cut back production. So that pushes the price up, then the Russians increase production and export. So they can benefit from the higher prices that is coming out of the hides of Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, what other oil exporters there are. So it's been reluctant to do that. So it seemed to me unlikely that they suddenly would say, let's become part of the group in a gas exporting consortium. But more than that, there's also the fact that, as I tried to argue, gas is not fungible. You kind of mix it up and you can sell it any place you want. You're limited to selling it where there's that pipeline. So in effect, Russia has that monopoly in Eastern Europe, the monopoly or a very strong presence this way in Germany, because nobody else has a pipeline there. You cannot afford to build a standby pipeline just in case it should be cut off. You can't spend $5-6 billion just having something sit there idle. So it seems to me unlikely. What they can do, of course, is try to coordinate, but not say, okay, we'll all cut together, because all Russia has, if Russia wants to cut, it can just do it unilaterally. And the same thing about any other country that's supplied this way. When you get LNG, then it becomes fungible, but as I tried to argue before, that requires an investment of, again, several $billion, and there's no spot market for it, which means you just simply, if you need additional natural gas, you just go out and order it, and somebody will be eager to supply you. You can't do it. So I think that's kind of suggesting threats without, or try to cause intimidation without much legitimacy to, and I don't think it's going to happen, in other words. I think it's going to happen, in other words. I think it's going to happen, in other words. I think it's going to happen, in other words. I think it's going to happen, in other words. I think it's going to happen, in other words. I think it's going to happen, in we'll see. I'll see if I'm right or wrong.
Not only my point of view, but there is this debate that United States went to Iraq for petrol or oil.
Mm-hmm.
So thinking about that and looking at this map, how do you interpret or how do you what do you think about what's United States doing?
The question is about the United States. Some have argued that the United States went into Iraq to get control of the oil sector. The Russians, by the way, are making some of the same allegations. They're arguing that this was all designed to help John McCain win the election. They're saying that about Georgia as well, but they're saying the same thing about Iraq. What are we doing? Well, there's another, in one of these meetings that we had, there was one Russian who stood up and said that the United States is doing everything it can to lead Russia astray, so to encourage Russia to increase oil production so it'll run out of oil production and the United States will have all the oil and basically put up the price. I only wish he were right. What are we doing? I don't think that's the reason we went into Iraq. Maybe some people argued that. I think there are a complex of other reasons. What are we doing? I think one of the things we should be doing and we're not doing is worrying about conservation and what can be done this way. And there you get some very mixed reactions because some of the people in the Republican administration have interests in oil. I mean, George W. Bush himself did. His father did as well. Cheney headed Halliburton. By the way, when I went out to the Priobsky oil field, what did we see out there? We saw Halliburton drilling. That's fine. I mean, my argument is the more the Russians sell us petroleum, the less dependent we are on the Middle East. So what are we doing? I don't think we know what we're doing, unfortunately. And I think for us, I spoke to a group the other day call it the AARP. I mean, who got the joke about prostate much better than this group did. They're none of them are interested in moving to smaller cars. Let their grandchildren worry about it. So what we're doing is we're pushing the burden on to our grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and it's too bad. It's partly the problem that we all have very short time horizons. Do I want to push the thermostat down in my home to 68? No, I don't want to do that. Do I want to walk? Not if I can avoid it. Not if I can take the car and go elsewhere. I saw that in the newspaper today here, there is the proposal that every student should have a bicycle. Well, since seniors are making those decisions, not seniors, but I doubt if your administrators are going to jump at that because how many of them ride bicycles? And what's the point? Some of them maybe say, make the university look like it's a leader, but for the most part, we don't do very much, and so we watch prices go down, and there goes conservation, and it's a problem. We really don't face up to it, and in the long run, I think this weakens us as a country, and it weakens us as individuals. But I'm still keep my thermostat at 72, and so I don't want to say I'm holier than anybody else because I'm not. Anybody? Yes, sir.
Question, I guess. I hear you say that this is a monoculture that's very much governed by oil and gas. As this gentleman points out, they're not diversifying their economy. As you point out, the princelings and political patronage, are these companies being run by qualified people? Is this a house of cards that's going to collapse on itself in 10 years?
are these companies, the question is, are these you find all this, there are no other industries, who's running these companies, are they qualified? For the most part, yes. And when they're not qualified, they usually have the foresight to hire outsiders. Even Gazprom. I mean, the Soviets were, I say, the world's largest producer of petroleum before the Soviet Union collapsed. So they've had a lot of experience, but they were very wasteful in the process. And so are they getting the most out of their resources? So I was just asked to work with Statoil, which is a Norwegian company, dealing in the Arctic. And they are big gas producers, again, the North Sea fields. And Statoil was hired by Gazprom to come in and help them develop some of their resources. So with the world as it is now, you can hire other companies. When I went out to the Priobsky oil field, not only was Halliburton there, but Schlumberger was there. Schlumberger is the French-American company. They're hired to do the drilling. And so you hire these technicians, whereas in the Soviet era, you did it all from within the country. So even if they're not qualified specialists, and some of them are, have drill, will travel. Just pay my fee, and with oil prices high, they can do that. So what the Russians were not good at was conservation in terms of getting the most out of their fields, and they used a drilling process that was very wasteful and reduced the long-term life of the fields. But now that's, they bring in other Western technicians who tell them that this is not the way to do it, and they're using new geological exploration techniques that Exxon has developed. I mean, I've had discussions with Exxon people who talk about they go out to Sakhalin in the Pacific and are using new drilling methods, new geological methods for determining what's there. It's as advanced as anything in the world, because this is what they do.
Is that any kind of balance then? Yeah.
Well,
Russia has a stranglehold on Europe for the gas.
yeah. Well, is there any balance? Is there anything we can do to use that technology to threaten or coerce the Russians? I don't think so. Why? Because as far as I can tell, the oil companies, any of these technology companies, can be bought off. I mean, there's no sense of solidarity. There's no sense this is a national issue. And this is also reflected in building pipelines. One of the things that's happening is the Russians control access to the pipelines to Central Asia for oil and gas, particularly gas. And we're trying, even Vice President Cheney is trying to help build a pipeline called Nabucco, which would bypass the Russian monopoly. But then the Russians go to each supplier, producer of gas, and say, you don't want to join Nabucco, we'll give you a better price. They then go to each customer, this is something that's down the road 10 years from now and it's not going to work. We'll sell you our gas right now and give you a cheap price. And they knock the props out from underneath it. So you can, balance off one after another. And I think it's a dog eat dog here in this way. And I'm gonna take care of myself, and I don't care about an international interest or an anti-Russian interest this way. It's a very powerful tool, and Putin, I've got to say, is very skillful. Cheney goes to Kazakhstan to try to convince Kazakhstan to build a gas pipeline from Kazakhstan through the Caspian Sea, through Azerbaijan, Georgia, Turkey, and out. The minute he leaves, Putin comes in and says, you don't want to do that. I'll give you a better deal. And Putin is like the man from Gazprom. He's worked very hard with us. And there are rumors that I couldn't put in the book because my publisher said you don't have documentation for it, and I do not, that Putin himself is now one of the richer oligarchs, having become the owner of large billions of dollars worth of Gazprom stock. Again, I don't have documentation for that, so I don't know. Yes?
I think you convincingly have shown us how, over the last decade, the old oligarchs have been replaced through patronage by Putin. So I guess related to your final comment just now, could you comment on, has there been also a renationalization of natural resources? Because I guess ultimately I'm asking, are we witnessing the rise of a petrogarchy instead of a petrostate? And if so, what are the ramifications of that in terms of the use of your term state?
Yeah.
I'm not being critical, I'm more interested in
Sure.
your information actually about that.
This is something I'll probably plagiarize in the future. It's called petrogarchy. He says, is what is happening here the fact that the state is...
I can take a cut.
he can take a cut. But to the extent is there renationalization here? To what extent are these people in charge and benefiting from it that I have on that other list? Yeah, to some extent that's what's happening. I mean, they are living fancy high lives. They're benefiting personally, and that's one of the things I wanted to show in this other thing with the Siloviki. I mean, it's staggering what they're doing, and if you're on the inside, that's good. I have a list of the original oligarchs who are being pushed out, but these people are leading a very rich life this way and have benefited personally enormously from it. And they're one of the questions is, what about Medvedev? Where does he stand in all this? And the point is, he doesn't stand here. These guys owe their loyalty to Putin. And Medvedev is going to have to put in his own buddies before he can expect that the bureaucracy will support him when push comes to shove. And at this point, who do they support if there should be a conflict? There's not yet. But if there should be a conflict between Putin and Medvedev, they're going to line up with Putin, to whom they owe their patronage and their prosperity. So down the road, maybe Medvedev, but it's going to take a while. He's got to ease some of these people out and put in his own buddies, and that's not going to happen overnight. Yep.
If I'm not mistaken, I think this year North Pole was shared between 5 countries, even though it doesn't belong to any country as a territory. I think it has lots of natural resources.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you think about United States and Russia having a consensus on sharing
Yeah.
world resources?
The question is, it begins with a preface that this year, let me back up and add something. The Russians sent a submarine under the Arctic ice to claim the North Pole. And they planted a medallion, a flag, this is ours. And then Canada, then the United States, then Denmark through Greenland began to do the same thing. So everybody's saying, I want to claim it and that's because there was the prospect or the assumption that the polar area may be very rich in petroleum resources. And so to what extent, the question is, to what extent is there cooperation along these lines? And at this point it's very hard to tell, but my assumption is, and my prediction is, there won't be much. And it could very lead to being a source of tension between each of the claimants to these resources. So we'll have to wait and see what's going on there. But there's just in the same way in the Pacific, there's tension between China and Japan over some of the islands that are there where it's thought there will be underwater deposits of energy. So I assume generally we'll be bumping into each other this way, over these issues because there's so much at stake. Of course, if Sarah Palin becomes the vice president, that may make it a little easier because she sits in her backyard and she sees everything that the Russians are doing. So it may work. That may be okay, but I suspect that's not going to happen. So yep.
Recently, Venezuela and Iran have admitted they're having trouble paying their bills.
Yeah.
Oil has dropped to half its previous price. Is Russia experiencing a similar fate?
Yeah, the question is, as oil prices fall to below $70 a barrel, will Russia begin to have will it begin to have financial problems just like Iran is having financial problems? Yes, Russia's budget is predicated on the assumption that oil prices are no lower than $70 a barrel. It's already below that. Again, that's why my wife says it's obsolete. So, yes, they could have problems, but they've built up enough of a slush fund, a stabilization fund, as they call it, that'll carry them over for a while. I do suspect that oil prices will probably go back up again, but every time I say that, they go down. So that gives you, yeah. I'm not a good predictor on those things. It's reassuring because I say they go down. Of course, that means they'll go up. Means they always do go down. So there's one thing I did predict here in the book, and that is that Russia would not tolerate the pipeline that was built through Georgia, which gave access to the Central Asian countries to get their oil and gas by bypassing the Russian pipeline, Gazprom's pipeline and the oil pipeline. And I said they would try to destabilize Georgia, and of course they did. Again, if I were only as insightful about the stock market, I would be much happier about this. But so it's we don't know what will take place. Okay, any other question? I think that's about it. So anyway, thank you very much. Oh, I should give a commercial because I think I'm going to go over and sign books. If you can't sell oil, I can sell books, I guess. Yes.